While it is true that models' context windows are getting larger and larger, it has become increasingly unclear if they're actually effective at using these large context windows. And I think you can say inversely, there's becoming more and more data coming out that's showing that they really kind of top out around 100,000 tokens at best. And so, as we can see, like Claude Sonnet this week launched a million token context window. What does it actually mean? Is it actually effective in using that? And so we're going to look at a bunch of different pieces of data. We'll be pulling a lot from Roma's context rot paper, which is one of the better modern studies on LLMs doing things with their large context windows, tested across a bunch of the current state of the art models at the time. And what it really digs into is that it goes much deeper than just needle in a haystack. When you see these models, providers launch these new models with large context windows, they almost always give some needle in a haystack experiment that show it's able to find it at every kind of level of large context, but that's a simple retrieval task. And most of the use cases that people are building with LLMs go to be like much more complex, of taking actions and doing things versus just finding something. And so we're going to run through all of their experiments, and we're going to look at a couple other supplementary pieces of resource here and come to kind of a final conclusion, like kind of what you need to keep in mind if you're building with LLM. So without further ado, we'll jump into the first experiment from Context Rot. So needle in the haystack with controlled ambiguity. Take one step back. For all of these experiments, they basically took a bunch of Paul Graham essays, they took a bunch of archive papers, and then the query is, what is the best writing advice I've received from my college roommate? That's somewhere in this haystack that they've put together, Paul Graham essays, and goes for the papers themselves. And so coming over here, for a lot of the setups, but especially for this one, they were looking at high similarity versus low similarity. So high performance models, medium and low. And generally what you see is that as input increases, and we're looking at accuracy on the y-axis. And so for higher performance model, they can stay pretty, good performance up to the upper level of a million token context window. But once the similarity, that kind of semantic similarity that you're looking for, decreases even just slightly, seeing drop-offs. And of course, as the models get less strong, you're basically seeing less performance. So the similarity plays a huge role here. As context grows, the performance drops faster when the question and supporting snippet are only loosely related. And even the best models degrade. So yeah, it's about that relationship between the question and that like supporting snippet that it's actually looking for. And as those become less semantically similar, or whatever way that you're using to kind of compare the two, it becomes much harder. And this is important because in these needle and haystack experiments, it's usually something very pointed, where there's like a math question in like a fiction book or something. And in that case, the question and the supporting snippet are, what you're looking for. And so they can be very related, versus if you're trying to solve some coding problem, like you have a rough idea of what you're trying to find, but that doesn't mean that your question and that like whatever you're trying to find in the code base are going to be semantically similar. So that becomes a huge issue. Next up are distractors. How do distractors essentially affect the performance of models in large contexts? So this one was really cool. So there's a question. I won this one before. What's the best writing advice I got from my college classmate? The needle, what they're looking for, it was like write every week. And there's a couple of distractors that they inserted. So the best writing tip I received from my college professor is write every day. The worst from a college classmate. Best from a classmate back in high school. So they're very similar, right? And basically in the initial version, it's just a needle. And then they also tested with one distractor and then 4 distractors. It kind of looked like this. By the way, these graphics are super helpful and not put together by me. So here we have no distractors in blue, 1 distractor in tan, and then 4 distractors in orange. And again, high performance, medium, and low. The high performance is probably like Claude 4 and GPT 4.1. And so you can see with no distractors, these are very similar to question, like high similarity, right? As we're seeing, these are very related. This is before. Remember, we're looking at both highly related, but also not so much related. So this is high similarity. All the models are like pretty good. Performance models are pretty low, but these are ones that nobody's really going to be using in production in like any capacity anyways. So it doesn't really matter. The blue is pretty stable. So you add 1 distractor and you see a huge gap. And that gap, of course, increases as the amount of context window increases as well. So it's all kind of downward sloping. And it grows even more, of course, with more distractors. So distractors can cause the model to not perform well. And the more distractors there are, the worse the performance will be. Again, this is super important because, again, in the real world, there are usually a lot of distracting elements that are very similar to whatever you're working on. So going back to a code base, you could be looking for like some function that does X, but also in your code base, you have a function that does X plus Y, and they have a lot of similarities, and the model can be like very tripped up by that. So there are some like prompting things I think you can keep in mind there. That's generally the takeaway. Next, which I touched a little bit on before, is needle haystack similarity. How does the model perform when the needle is very similar to the content in the haystack versus when it's very different or distinct? So, for example, we have the two haystacks here, the Paulgram essays. Well, I guess we're just looking at one example, Paulgram essays. And in the first one, it's going to be a similar needle, that one we we're looking before at writing advice from college classmates, to the other needle used in the archive papers. So then we'll see how the model does at retrieving them. Again, similar needle haystack, similarity, and low needle haystack similarity. Generally speaking, it's kind of a mix. So pretty close for the archive haystack when it's an archive needle versus a Paulgram needle, right? Like this is basically the same. In the Paulgram haystack, I did a much better job of finding the distinct needle, the archive needle, compared to the Paulgram needle. This is a marketable difference, but this is a small test or whatever. Take whatever data you want from it as you will. And with just the two data points, they don't point in the same direction, since this is even, this is not. And so it can get harder. Yeah, the trend is not consistent. Haystack structure. So this one was really cool. So again, original Paulgram haystack with the original needle versus in the shuffled case, it's not just the like coherent blog, how it kind of reads here. It's a bunch of different like sentences like interjected from different sources. So it's still all Paulgram essay related information, but it's kind of mixed up or shuffled. Yeah, same essays randomly ordered. And coming to the performance here, shuffled outperforms original across all 18 models, which is pretty counterintuitive. I would have guessed this one would be easier, but that's not the case. So we can look at both archive, did it with archive with the archive needle, archive Paulgram, Paulgram archive, Paulgram. And in every case, the shuffle, the light blue one, actually performs better. So that means it was able to find the needle at a higher rate when the surrounding haystack was like shuffled versus what we would call like coherent. It's pretty wild. Again, it's not something I would have guessed, but maybe speaks to some underlying attention mechanism of the model. And the last one, which is maybe my favorite. So it's based on long mem eval, which is a long running memory evaluation for LLMs, where it's basically kind of like there's a question or some context within like a really large ChatGPT conversation, and you see if it can pull that out. And so the goal is generally like measure how adding irrelevant chat history hurts answer quality. So you have this long chat conversation, somewhere in the middle is like the answer to some question you're about to have. How does it affect when it's like a really long conversation versus like a very short, only the related information? And so there's two conditions. Focused input, which was only about 300 tokens, and it contains only relevant information from the chat history for whatever that question is. So if you're asking a question about like, your trip to Paris, it would only pull in the 300 related tokens of whenever you were talking about that in the conversation, versus the full input, which is about 13,000 tokens. It contains the whole history. So we're not cherry picking. Essentially, the first one does like a little bit of RAG, and the second one is just the whole thing. And they did it across Claude, OpenAI, and Gemini, and we'll look at all of those. So focus is again that 300 token context versus full is like 113,000. And we can see generally across the board, red much higher than blue, like a lot higher in some cases, even with the smartest models. Interesting to see how much better thinking does for this case versus the change in performance in the focus versus full. So thinking in this case really helps it reason through a large amount of context. I think that's something that's really important to take away, and you see here and here. But it's not super helpful if you're only sending 300 bits of context. But that's something to keep in mind when dealing with large context windows and the decision of when to use thinking or not. This is the biggest gaps, by the way, across any of the models we'll look at. So GPT, which I'm pretty sure in this case, okay, yeah, they have it here. GPT-4, O3, a couple others. Gap, much smaller, but still very noticeable. 13 percentage points is a big difference. Reasoning effort, high and low, are surprisingly similar. Like we're not seeing that big difference like as we saw with Claude for Opus. The non-thinking models are much worse at it. That's a huge difference. And yeah, that trend kind of continues. And then what I thought maybe is maybe the most interesting part of this whole paper is just how good the Gemini performance is on large context windows. In this case, 100,000-ish tokens. So not millions, but 100,000 is what was tested. And this is where you see the gap close the most. So Gemini 2.5 Pro thinking, look how close this is. It's super close. You do see a big jump, as we saw with Claude 4 Opus, from thinking to not thinking. Flash thinking performed really well. Did they do to Flash? Yeah. Okay. So you have a non-reasoning model here to give like some context. So again, the takeaway I'm having here is that it looks like Gemini probably does have the best large context window for like, especially in like a chat environment, is what I would take away from this. So that's all super interesting. The one other benchmark I always love to come to is Function Live Bench. So what this does is, again, it doesn't focus on retrieval. A lot of the stuff we just looked at focused on retrieval. It focuses on comprehension. The test is here. I'm conducting a test. I'm going to give you a story and then give you a question. And then it gives, however many tokens of the story and then asks you to finish the question. So we'll say, here's 8,000 tokens of a story. What was Jerome's name? So this is about comprehension degree, or like it will ask you to continue the story or to like summarize something or other. So it's a little bit more than just retrieval. I update this pretty often. Yes, see, they added GPT-5, so that's good. I haven't seen this since. We have the model and then the token context window. So again, we're not even pushing all the way. We're getting up there and scanning again. GPT-5 much better at long context. Wow, that's actually a huge jump. Still phenomenal model overall and very good large context, but a huge drop from 120 to 192. There's something to note. And I think Grok was the best one the last time we looked here. Oh no, here we go. GPT 2.5 Pro, I think is still the soda on this. Grok 4, where's Grok 4? So expensive, but still very good. Grok 4 and GPT-5 is a soda. They share amazing, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so I would say GPT-5, Grok 4, and Gemini 2.5 seem to be performing the best here. So we look at Gemini 2.5, we'll come back up. 90%, GPT-5, 90%, 60, 100%, 80%. That's pretty good. Where's Grok? Yeah, Grok really good at large context. It was going to cost you a ton of money. So that's generally where we're at, I would say, at this point with large context windows. Generally, a rule of thumb is I think above 100,000, it gets pretty dicey. And then these models, will continue to say that they can handle millions of tokens. And so we'll keep an eye on this. This has changed over time. And thanks to everyone who's putting out these data and like very interesting information, so we can actually understand and better learn like how to actually use these models at scale. So thanks, and we'll talk to you soon.